So we begin our lesson this morning by sharing that it was a beautiful surprise from the universe and yet another lovely reminder that by following guidance and embracing the unknown with love, things have a magical way of unfolding in surprisingly wonderful and unexpected ways. That's how one woman described her first experience of walking a labyrinth. She'd always wanted to walk one, but she never had until, as they say, out of the blue, one appeared to her. She and her husband were hiking in a national park out in California. And for a while, they had lived a very nomadic lifestyle. They had no home base. They traveled around staying in Airbnbs and short-term rentals and hotels all around the world. And while that lifestyle certainly comes with a bit of a variety and a certain element of the unknown, they still planned for their future. They had a schedule in place and they always followed that schedule. But then they decided to step outside of that comfort zone that they had created, all of that scheduling and all of the planning. And instead they decided they were gonna pack up their Jeep with a tent, a laptop, and a phone plan with unlimited data, and just let the universe lead them. And eventually it led them to the labyrinth. And it turned out to be a very moving experience for her, one that she found to be a powerful validation for continuing to follow her path, to trust her path, and to trust it as it appeared. So the labyrinth, what it is, what it means, how it's used, this is our focus for our lesson today as we do look ahead to the celebration of World Labyrinth Day on Saturday coming up. Now, the labyrinth is something that history shows goes back to the prehistoric times. In the Middle Ages, walking a cathedral labyrinth was considered a valid substitute for a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, because not everyone was physically able to make the long and very arduous trek, to the Holy Land. It is something that is found in different cultures all around the world. While not exclusively, it is often used as a part of one's spiritual practices. Sometimes you'll hear a labyrinth being referred to as a maze, but that's not what it is. Unlike a maze, a labyrinth is not something that exists to challenge you. You cannot make a wrong turn. You cannot get lost. There are no dead ends. There are no traps just waiting to get you along the pathway. But it is a pathway just followed one step at a time. One step at a time, one that guides you to its center and then back out once again. There are more spiritual meanings and symbolism associated to the labyrinth than I could possibly share this morning. But there are some common meanings that I've often heard many people apply to it in general. For example, labyrinth is often seen as a symbol for spiritual development or spiritual enlightenment. It's a symbol for inner growth. It represents that journey to our own center, to that place of wonderful self-discovery, and then stepping back out into the world. The psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung, he viewed the labyrinth as a symbol of reconciliation between the inner self and the external world. And a labyrinth is seen as well as just a powerful tool that supports other spiritual practices such as prayer and meditation, mindfulness, and so forth. Now, one of the more unique associations that's made to the labyrinth can be found in the traditions of the Lakota Native American tribe. And the association is one that is made with the 4 directions and the 4 seasons. And I wanted to share that particular one with you today. While on the labyrinth, the Lakota view each direction as symbolic of the different directions our lives can take and the qualities that support our movement through each one. So they start with East, and for them, East represents wisdom. They teach that light comes from the East. And the affirmation for that is that it illuminates all. It illuminates everything. And that wisdom we're seeking is now very clear for us to see and call forth in our lives. And it's associated as well with this time that we're in right now, this time of spring. And then south. South for the Lakota is associated with generosity. They teach that the sun is highest in the south and the season is summer. And how they, and I think many of us would agree that summer is a time of ample abundance. And with that, we can be generous. We can call upon our generosity, not only in giving of our material things, but also just being generous in spirit. Moving to the west, that's associated with bravery and courage. The sun, they say, it sets in the west, and the chill of the unknown starts to set in. And so we call upon that courage. We call upon the bravery to support us as we face the unknowns in our lives, as darkness begins to set in. And that is the time associated with autumn and fall. And then lastly, there's north. And north is associated with patience and tolerance. They talk about how the time is now cold. The time is now dark. It is the season of winter. And these two qualities of patience and intolerance, that's what we can use to transform the darknesses in our lives into light. And for them, and the way they teach it is that it is the eternal light of the East. And so this is just one example of the deeper meanings and symbolism that can be explored or even used as a guide when considering a labyrinth experience for yourselves. It's one that can be a supportive guide as you contemplate how to best move through all of the different directions and cycles and seasons that come in and out of your life. The next aspect of a labyrinth that I wanted to share is maybe one of the more powerful of the overall experience. It's actually called the power of the turn. The power of the turn. I imagine that many, if not all of you, are familiar with the magazine publication of Spirituality and Health. And last year, in honor of World Labyrinth Day, their online version of that magazine offered a series of articles about labyrinths. And one of them focused on the many turns in a labyrinth and the symbolic or metaphysical, metaphorical meanings that they offer. And the article offered that one way that we can view turns of a labyrinth, just in general, might be to see them as a chance to look at our own lives from a new perspective, to look at our lives from a new perspective. And then they went down and they dug deeper into more exacting examples as to how that perspective can take form. So let's start just by envisioning the labyrinth itself. Just envisioning the labyrinth, its design. And the standard labyrinth is one that has over 20 180-degree turns in it. This path, it has this back and forth weaving built into it, right? And as you experience that weave, one moment you find yourself being drawn closer to the center, and then you reach one of those 180-degree turns, and in a moment you find yourself being moved further away from the center. And the design, this aspect of the design is symbolic of the way our lives change, how life has its twists and its turns as we go through it, how expectations that we can hold on to can be changed in a heartbeat by different tangents that show up in life, the curveballs, if you will, that life can present. And so how can we use the turns of the labyrinth to gain new perspectives about our lives? Well, we can approach each turn on the pathway as a very rich opportunity, a wonderful gift. It's an opportunity to look at all the things that have happened in our lives and how we have responded to them. To just look at everything in our lives and how we've responded to them. And the beauty about doing that anytime and in any place, you don't have to be on a labyrinth to do it, is that you have the opportunity to reframe some of those things perhaps, or just think about them in terms of the possibility that might exist to see them differently. The possibility that might exist to see them, to gain new perspective on them. And one specific example of a practice that we can do to try this is to look at the way we use the words and the labels good and bad. We label things good and bad. It's not uncommon for us to use those labels multiple times throughout every day, because every day things are happening in our lives, seemingly nonstop. I mean, I could wake up and make myself breakfast, right? And after I finish eating that breakfast, I could say, well, that was good. And then I can go 15 feet into my living room, sit down and finish a book I've been suffering through reading. And when I get to the end, I'd say, well, that was bad. Or maybe even later in the day, I might have a doctor's appointment and I'm not looking forward to that because there's going to be testing involved or whatnot. But then when that's all done, I might sit back and say, well, that wasn't so bad. I can go on and on and on. And it's because we, almost without thinking about it, without being aware of it, that we attach this good and bad label to so much of our life experiences. Because of that, the author of the article suggested that we consider these two labels as hypothesis instead of the truth. To consider the label of good and or bad a hypothesis instead of the truth. Instead, being open to other possible outcomes and then watching to see how everything actually turns out. The author said that when we are able to see something from more than one viewpoint, that is the power of the 180-degree turn. Another way to practice gaining greater perspective is to narrow the experience, the labyrinth experience, the scope of it. Instead of that 20,000, 30,000 foot view of just looking at our life in general, focus instead on just one specific life event, one that is still unsettled in you in some way. There is something about it that is not allowing you to be at peace with it, something that you want to use the labyrinth to explore at greater depth. And so as you come to the 180-degree turns, this is where it's suggested that you call to mind what happened and the labels you applied to it at the time. How did you label it? Use those turns to consider any beliefs you may have adopted because of that event. And then on the straighter paths in between the turns, you can consider things like, what lessons did that event bring? What blessings did it bring? Who came into your life because of that event? How were you strengthened? What did you discover? Where have you been led since that event? And the intention here is to just honestly assess, whether we really believe that a life event, this particular event, truly was the cause of the hurt or the suffering or the pain that we may be feeling. Or was that perhaps the result of decisions we made about the event, beliefs we held about that event, or maybe just our behavior in reaction to that event? See, because we don't have the ability to change anything about our past, but we absolutely have the ability to choose how we view it. We absolutely have the ability to not allow it to continue to be a source of upset for us. Now, the labyrinth, I believe, is typically seen as being a very individual, a very personal experience. And while that may be the case, there is still perspective to be gained when walking a labyrinth with others. If we go back to the back and forth weaving of that design, you'll find that when you're walking in tandem with others, there are points where you're going to end up right next to another person on the path. And then you come to one of those turns and you find yourselves moving further and further away from each other on that path. And that's simply symbolic of how people come in and then move out of our lives over the years. And sometimes it can be as short as just a few minutes of being with another person, whether it's right there on a labyrinth or just in life in general, that can still leave a very powerful impact on how we view life going forward. The author of the article in Spirituality and Health shared a story of how she was leading a group of women one day in walking a labyrinth. And it was a very large one. It was one that she said was painted on a parking lot of a church where they were gathered. And for those of you who have been out to Unity Village or just seen pictures of it, online or in print material, you know that that's what we have out on the village grounds. It's a huge labyrinth. It's painted on one of the large open asphalt areas of the campus there. And so the author shared that at one point, a car pulled up right to the edge of the labyrinth there in the parking lot. And one of the women who was on the labyrinth walked right off of it, got in the car, and it drove right off. She didn't acknowledge anybody. She didn't even offer a goodbye. And so once the group completed their walk, they all joined together in like a sharing circle. They were going to just share with each other what their experiences had been like. And one of the ladies said that there were times on that pathway when she felt very, very safe. She told of how she had entered the labyrinth behind a woman who was in front of her, whose name was Bambi. And she was ahead of a woman who was a nurse. And she went on to explain that her very best friend throughout her childhood was a toy deer, and that her mother had been a nurse. And for her, she said it felt like she was lovingly sandwiched between the two. And then she went on to say that every time she came upon one of those 180-degree turns, she came face to face with another woman from the group who was a widow. And this woman's greatest fear in her life at that time was that one day she would be a widow. And yet she said she felt safe because of the presence of her mother and Bambi. Then she asked for the name of the woman who had left the labyrinth without saying goodbye. And the author of the article shared that her name was Pat. And this lady just gasped out loud. And she said that her daughter's name was Pat, and that her daughter had died at a very, very young age. And she said, Pat left the labyrinth of life without saying goodbye. This woman's walk had become a powerful metaphorical journey through some of the most heartfelt, loving, touching, painful, and fearful times in her life. One of which she was now gaining wonderful new insights, wonderful healing insights and perspectives about those times. And it was an experience that the others realized and were awed by would never have been possible had they not been there to play the roles that they did for her. So maybe keep that in mind the next time you're on a labyrinth and there are others with you, because you never know if you're going to serve that role for someone else, or if they've showed up unknowingly to everybody to be that role of support for you. Earlier, I noted that the labyrinth is often seen as a spiritual practice, but you don't have to be spiritual at all, not at all, to enjoy it and to gain benefit from it. For those without a spiritual side, it can be used as a means to simply take a quiet walk on a set path, maybe just to attain a level of focus that isn't possible in the midst of all the busyness and the noise of everyday life. For those who do see it as a spiritual tool, use it as one, just know that there's really not a right or a wrong way, to walk it. From just the materials I've read through in preparation for today, I could probably create 5 more Sunday lessons and not have any overlap at all. It would have new thoughts, new rituals, new symbolisms, and so forth. Yeah, but there are a few things that are very common to the teachers and the articles that I've been exposed to about this that are recommended. And the first of those is to take a moment before stepping onto the path. Just take a moment to affirm a calming, a clearing of your mind. To just be as open as possible before you start out. You could say a prayer, whether out loud or just to yourself. You can utter a mantra that means something to you. You could take a couple of cleansing breaths if you wanted to, do some stretching or whatnot. And then when you enter into the labyrinth, take your walk slowly. And some even say walk deliberately. Be deliberate with your steps. Really feel your feet touching and leaving the earth, one after the other. And that walk towards that center, sometimes that's where the questions are asked. That's sometimes where people will start to just silently release things that they know they no longer want to carry with them as they walk through life. Sometimes that walk to the center is just simply affirming that whatever spiritual truths you may be seeking that day, they are already in you. They are within you, and the more you affirm that, the greater opportunity they have to come forth and make themselves known to you. And then in that center point, when you reach the center, that's often used just as a place to stop, to just pause, to embrace where life's journey has brought you so far. You could also use that center point to practice the traditions of the Lakota, to turn to each of the directions, the north, the south, the east, the west, and to claim those qualities of wisdom and generosity and bravery and courage and patience and tolerance, for yourself and for your life. It's a place in the center where you can set the intention for your go forward and all of life that still waits for you. And then as you journey out, when you start making your walk out of that labyrinth, imagine that future, vision it in your own mind. Reaffirm the beliefs that you do still hold and you want to keep holding on to. Open yourself to whatever the universe wants to offer. And use the power of the turns on your way out to remind yourself that you can offer powerful and positive responses to the turns you are yet to encounter in your individual lives. As World Labyrinth Day approaches, perhaps you could consider that a labyrinth is the dance floor of the soul. A labyrinth is the dance floor of the soul. I want to give credit where credit is due. Right around this time last April, I was meeting and having lunch with my local interfaith colleague group. And we were each sharing how we each were doing, how our churches were doing. Did we have any special events and activities on our calendars and so forth? And so I began to share about our upcoming celebration that we had last year for World Labyrinth Day out on our Sacred Steps Labyrinth on the grounds. And some of my colleagues had actually joined us in previous years for that special walk we did on that day of celebration. And so our conversation moved into a discussion about the wonderful ritual of a labyrinth and the different experiences that for those of us who had walked them in our lives, so the experiences we had had. And at one point, as that conversation was kind of moving towards its close, Chris Lane, who is the associate pastor, many of you know him, at Central United Methodist Church downtown, he kind of sat back in his chair and he tilted his head and he had this very thoughtful look on his face. And he says, I think a labyrinth is the dance floor of the soul. And so when I got back to the office that day, I wrote that down. I put it in my Sunday lesson planning file, knowing I had one lesson title already for 2020, because I knew that would be my lesson title for this year's talk about the labyrinth itself. And here's the beauty of that dance. Here's the beauty of the dance of the labyrinth. It's not hard. It's not a hard dance. It's not one with complicated movements. It doesn't have complex steps. It's not one where you have to keep looking at your feet to make sure they're going in the right direction. It's not one where you have to spend time focusing and concentrating or memorizing what step's going to come next that you need to take. In fact, this dance is one where you're not supposed to look 3 steps ahead or even back from where you've come. It's a dance of 1 step and then 1 step and then 1 step. Each of these steps being guided with an ease of knowing that it's impossible for you to be lost, to get lost. It's a spiritual metaphor for knowing that it's impossible for you to ever get truly lost in your life. For the universe is stepping in unison with you. One step and then one step. The universe is with you, weaving back and forth, helping you to negotiate those 180-degree turns, often offering those beautiful surprises, the lovely reminders, always inviting you back to your center, that place where you can embrace the unknown with love. God bless you. All right, so this is our time that we like to take a moment to bless our offerings, our financial gifts for this week. And so I want to just continue extending to you my gratitude and appreciation for the financial support that's being offered to the ministry during this time of being away from the campus. And so, again, just know that you're always in my heart in that regard in a very special way. And so if you have your gifts there with you, please just hold them in your hands. And if you're going to go online after the service and use the online giving features, just hold your offerings in your hearts, knowing and affirming again that every gift given from the heart has the power to transform lives. And so, grounded in that truth, I offer on behalf of all of us the words to our offertory blessing. God is my source, and I give generously of my abundance in all forms. I live a consciousness of prosperity, and I joyfully step into the flow of giving and receiving. I believe that every moment offers a gift, one to give or one to receive. So I give thanks for the prosperity in my life, and I celebrate the unlimited possibilities present in every moment. And so it is. Amen.